Welcome to the Western Bell podcast series, with talks on traditional spiritual teaching and its application in the world today. The intention of the series is to offer something useful for those who are drawn to study themselves and engage practice on the spiritual path. New talks are posted twice each month. The content of the talks is for informational purposes only and not to provide any kind of counseling, medical, or professional advice. This podcast is titled The Crisis of Continuity of Wisdom. The talk was given by Rob Schmidt and Stuart Goodnick on August 30th, 2025 via Zoom. Rob and Stuart run Tayu Meditation Center and Many Rivers Books and Tea in Sebastopol, California. They invite spiritual teachers, practitioners, and authors to articulate their stories on the Mystical Positivist podcast. In this presentation, they consider the tendency to hold on to familiar forms that had been taught by deceased teachers in traditions, with the aim of remaining true to the teaching, and the need to change with the times, circumstances, and people if a living tradition is to continue. Rob and Stuart believe that conversation among well-intentioned people on the path is a feature that supports the continuity of spiritual wisdom, and they engage in some lively discussion with those in attendance about risk, the paradigm of the teacher-student relationship, transmission, coming from a don't-know state, aligning with higher will, trust and receptivity, and other topics. They refer to the teachings of George Gurdjieff, E.J. Gold, Lee Lozowick, and their own teacher, Robert Daniel Ennis. If there is benefit in this talk for you, please consider sharing the link to it or writing a review on social media or on one of the podcast platforms. Rob Schmidt speaks first, then Stuart Goodnick.
I want to begin by pointing out that this is meant to be a conversation. And so I will invite those who think they have something to contribute to go ahead and do it. So that's just my starting point. And it's actually part of my end point as well, because I actually happen to think that conversation is a tool that needs to be relied upon. We need to rely upon this very human tool in order to navigate the consequences of the continuity issue in terms of spiritual practice. So I invite you for that reason as well to let us know what you think about this topic. We have an ongoing weekly conversation with some fourth way practitioners. The numbers vary of those. And then we've also done some of our mystical positivist podcasts with some of those folks. And one of the themes that I remember focusing on was the translation of Gurdjieff's work in the 21st century. One of the notable people, she was a mystical positivist guest, a prominent teacher of the Gurdjieff movements. And she made the, not just observation, but the strong statement that while there's a lot of repetition of Gurdjieff movements around the world, she was despairing that, and she is a very senior practitioner of Gurdjieff movements, a lot of those people around the world don't seem to appreciate what Gurdjieff was trying to accomplish with the continuation of that practice and the transmission of that practice. And I thought that was an apposite point, but also it was reflected in many of the other conversations we've had on the mystical positivist, in person, etc. My teacher, Robert Ennis, used to very much be in favor of relying on conversation between and among spiritual practitioners. So this discussion tonight is something that I hope will elicit contributions from some of the many people listening and hopefully joining us.
In that theme of conversations we've had with practitioners in the fourth way, it's been an interesting thing because we tend to have conversations with people who are outside the lineages of the Gurdjieff Foundation. And in fact, sometimes some of the conversations are about and in reference to friction that the Gurdjieff Foundation may have with other lineages to other teachers and associates of Gurdjieff. It's not friction in the sense of battles and doctrinal things. It's more that the Gurdjieff Foundation presents often as really trying to cling and feel like they are holding on to the true tradition in all of its authentic form, which means the music, the movements, the exercises, the whole package in one sense. And yet, outside of the Gurdjieff Foundation, you'll find different groups that emphasize one or other elements a little bit more, like they may emphasize the readings of Beelzebub's Tales, which is something that's not so much emphasized in the Gurdjieff Foundation. Or you might find groups like folks like Joseph Azizi in Australia who are really unpacking and bringing forward some of the more heart-centered exercises that Gurdjieff offered. So in all of this mix, there's this thread of what people are doing with this tradition once Gurdjieff was gone, and there was no necessarily recognized leader or single person who is authorized to carry the tradition forward. So how do people deal with that? With the Gurdjieff Foundation, for instance, it feels as though there's a reluctance to deviate from a certain kind of formula, whereas some of the other traditions that we've seen seem to strike an interesting balance between being true to the original form, but also exploring nuances of that form that may not have been so obviously explicated in and around the time of Gurdjieff.
So I don't mean to have us focus just on the fourth way tradition at all. Of course, what I hope will emerge from this conversation are perspectives from many different practitioners. I know on a personal level that some of the folks on this call have experience in multiple traditions. So I invite reflections on this central problem. Number one, I think it's fair to ask, what is the utility of making despairing comments about the future with regard to the continuity of the tradition? Is that a useful technique or position to take? And if it is, to what extent could there be a greater sense of inclusiveness to other points of view? This is even relevant to our political situation now, I think. And yet it also has a resonance far beyond our current political situation. But I actually wonder how we can conceive of the way to proceed in general as people acknowledge that there is not an obvious path forward. And is there necessarily a single path forward for any given tradition?
I'll add one comment, just that, we were talking about the fourth way and the formal fourth way tradition. That always arises to us as an interesting question because our lineage in the fourth way is anything but standard. Our teacher worked with E.J. Gold, and E.J. Gold was kind of a shapeshifter. Those of you who are familiar with his work, who would take on the form of one tradition or another tradition and work with his students and colleagues with that tradition as intensely as though he were born into it. Nonetheless, the language and the framework and the point of view of the fourth way always seemed to be a ground in his work, as it became a ground in Robert Daniel Innes's work and our own work with Taiyu Meditation Center. We are not orthodox fourth way people, even though we'll say that we are fourth way. And what that means for us is that we have a very different relationship to the formality of the tradition, because we've had demonstrated the possibility that the tradition is intended to serve the purposes of the work we are not necessarily completely obligated to serve the formality of the original tradition. And so that's an important distinction, I think, that we all have to ask ourselves. Are we holding on to something, or are we in conversation with something?
There's this underlying issue of this consideration, which is risk aversion. It seems to me that one element of figuring out how to have continuity of any lineage is a willingness to embrace some degree of risk.
Mm.
And I know my own teacher was always saying, after I'm gone, here's a list of the ways you can screw up. Don't do any of these. But it seems to me, as you were suggesting, that we have to be willing to invent something new, or at least engage a certain curiosity about what's relevant in today's circumstance, as opposed to clinging to what I think my teacher would have wanted.
That's a great point. There are a couple things I wanted to say about that. Our own teacher, Robert Innes, would always say it's necessary to goof gloriously. In other words, if you're going to make a mistake, make a big mistake, because that way you can learn. And that was a very powerful kind of enabler to make mistakes. And I've made plenty of mistakes in my own spiritual work, but it wasn't the end of the world. It was an opportunity. And I contrast that with what I see sometimes in some communities, and I'll again reference fourth way communities, that sometimes there's this paralysis of fear about wiseacring, which is a Gurdjieff term for screwing up or doing something you shouldn't be doing because of egoistic concerns or the like. But if you're so terrified of wiseacring or being seen to be wiseacring, then that creates a kind of inhibition. And yes, being uninhibited can be its own kind of problem, but somewhere there's a balance of being willing to stick your neck out. And if you stick your neck out, maybe your head gets chopped off, and that's probably a good thing. But that was the kind of philosophy that our teacher had. And I think that's an important thing to remember, that mistakes are not the end of the world. If you're open and willing to learn from whatever happens, then mistakes are part of the path.
Thanks for the question. Any other questions or comments?
First of all, I object to the term fourth way practitioner. I think it's the soup of the soup to start with. It's an Ouspenskyization that's been Ouspenskyized another time. But my main question is there transmission? Is there transmission? Is the proof of the pudding as to whether something has changed? Does it still work? Does it work?
Mm-hmm.
And the last thing I want to add here is that even if it does work, it depends on an upswell of people who want to engage in it. And I can remember in the 70s on the commune where I was, there was new blood almost every month. We're hungry. Of course, we had a good teacher at that time, but there was an active interest, and I don't see that now. That's my comment.
Thank you for that comment. And I'm sympathetic to much of what you had to say. My understanding is that Gurdjieff took pains to acknowledge that the times change. And we're not in charge of that. He wasn't in charge of that. He responded to conditions as he found them. And so we need to, it seems to me at least, respond to the conditions that we find in our contemporary world. And the challenges that we face in terms of attracting people, I used to think that that was a sign that I was not doing my work. But what I actually have come to the conclusion is that that was an egoistic view of what was required of me. Another possibility is that there are narratives of 500 AD in Western Europe where the mystical work of Christianity had to go underground into monasteries and various other possible ways to support folks who had a different view of this possibility for mystical union with however you want to characterize it. So I don't think I have to feel bad because there are fewer people, young people, deciding to pursue spiritual practice. It's not up to me. That's beyond my pay grade, as it were. But that doesn't mean either that I get to dismiss the potential to touch other people's hearts and minds. That to me would be my gauge for the effectiveness of whatever it is that I'm called to do. But I just want to point out that we're called to do different things at different times in different circumstances. And it doesn't mean that there's some kind of failure. And I guess that was part of my motivation for the suggestion to talk about this topic, because I think it's all too common to criticize ourselves as inadequate. That's an American and probably Western mistake, I think. So as long as I'm sincere and open-hearted, I don't know what else I could be expected to provide. My teacher used to have me go out with a placard. It was like an A-frame I had over my head.
Sandwich board.
Sandwich board. Thank you. But that was the time for that. And that was a teaching for me. It really didn't bring in anybody because I was embarrassed to do it. I didn't expect to have success, but I wasn't averse to that possibility. Nevertheless, I just think that the times have changed. People are different than they were in the 70s. I remember the 70s. That was when I met my teacher and started my work. I'm sensitive or sensible of your criticism of fourth way practitioner. And in part, I agree with the implicit criticism, and I invite you to say more about it.
I want to add a couple comments there. One is that what I resonated most strongly with is the idea that the proof of the pudding is if there is a transmission of something. And part of my quibble sometimes with some of the fourth way people we talk with is I see plenty of evidence of transmission, but a reluctance to acknowledge it for fear of wiseacring and all that sort of thing. But the transmission is important. I would underscore what Rob said, that this idea that size matters, I think, is a Western construct which gets us into big trouble with spiritual communities when the teacher is really trying to bring in the masses.
When we were in Germany speaking to the community around Omsi Park, and I brought up the topic of one of the real difficulties with communication between sanghas is it often devolves into my spiritual daddy is bigger than your spiritual daddy.
The other thing I was thinking about in that regard is if you look at the history of Zen, there were Zen patriarchs that had maybe 2 or 3 students.
Right.
And they transmitted. As you said, transmission is the key. So something was passed on. And there are times where there will be lots of people who are engaged and receptive to work, and times when there's not that many. And again, as Rob said, that's out of our pay grade. If we find ourselves pandering to the masses, that's a problem. What I loved about Lee Lozowick's website was you go to the website and it said, if you're looking for enlightenment, go somewhere else. It was a different note that he was sounding, and it was a note that would only register in the deepest aspects of your heart. And if you felt that call, you would be drawn no matter what forces were in your way. And yes, in the 70s, there were a lot of people responding to that call. Today, it's different. People seem to be responding to a different call. Is that good or bad? No, there's still people who are responding to the need for connection to a deep spiritual lineage. And for those people, we have to be awake and aware and available in order to facilitate those kinds of connections. But if it's 2 people versus 2,000 people, that doesn't really matter.
To elaborate a little on the term fourth way practitioner, I'll just quickly say fourth way is a substitute for the work. And I think it was instilled or brought forth in order to make it more attractive to modern people, because work doesn't sound very appealing. And practitioner was never attached. I assume it's an Eastern term. It's a term that comes out of a different culture, and that's fine. But for the work, it was never about practice. It was about path to somewhere. It was about getting somewhere. And that is obfuscated by the idea of just being a practitioner, which to me is a connotation of like almost like a craftsman or something like that.
And I think that's fair, but we're in the realm of language. And it's one thing how we describe, and it's another thing what we do. And to the extent that people think there's a formula and think if I do these things over and over again, that's sufficient as a practice, I would agree that that can be problematic.
Let me just jump in here. I have a different view. I've had 3 careers in my life other than the central guiding understanding of how to create a context where I get to ask myself effective questions about who I am, what I'm doing, and why I'm doing it. And the first career I had in the world was as a craftsman. The second career was in academia. The third career was starting and running a bookstore, a spiritual bookstore. So I don't have any problem with using the metaphor of a craftsperson for someone who understands that tools are to be used. And there should be no hesitance, it seems to me, or at least I'm not hesitant to use the term. I remember that my teacher, well before he met Lee Loswick, used the term practitioner, and I'm happy to use it. It's an okay term as long as you realize, as with all other language, that there are certain things that are pointed to with a word that may be relevant for some people and not other people. But anyway, thanks for the clarification on that.
So many things have come up along the way. First, I thought that the whole premise, the crisis of continuity of lineage, is a straw dog. And you've touched on many of the reasons for that already. But going on from that, the Gurdjieff work was an expression of Gurdjieff's being. It ended when Gurdjieff transitioned off of this plane to wherever he went. Genuine work is going to appear as an expression of the being of the individual presenting it, the teacher, if that's even the way to go. So it's not going to look like the Gurdjieff work. The Gurdjieff work, from the foundation, from my experience of it, is it's like the Catholic Church after Christ. If that's the best you can do, actually, that's not so bad. Look at all the Christian mystics that have arisen in the last 2,000 years, sans Christ's presence. So that could work also. But conscious labors and intentional suffering is not a great selling point in our culture anymore. So it's going to have to look different. And I'm tuned into E.J. Gold's work, and he's very creative in what he's presenting and reaching a different demographic, a younger demographic. And I'm also thinking we look to the past to frame the future, and the future is an unknown. And I can think of 2 examples. Lee said in one of his writings that he wanted the school or the students to replace him. He never appointed a lineage heir, though there are people operating pretty successfully who work with him. Also, I remember Thich Nhat Hanh saying that the next Buddha will not be a person, but will be a group. So this is a very different view, perhaps more realistic view of the way it needs to go from this hierarchical single person as a source. This doesn't negate or obviate that, but the times they are changing, as a famous singer said.
Well, you remind me of a previous point that got dropped, and I just wanted to say that I'm not so sure that Americans are not willing to sign up for work. The American culture seems to be work obsessed. But the question is what you mean by capitalized W work. And that's the distinction that I think is more relevant here.
Success obsessed is different than work obsessed.
I completely agree with you. And yet people think about success through work. I think that's a fair observation.
First, on this point of work and the attractiveness of conscious suffering and intentional labors, I don't think that's ever been attractive in any era, honestly. And I think what's different in different eras might be the numbers of people who have a hunger for something that transcends what's served up by ordinary life. But I don't think it's ever a particularly attractive proposition, no matter how well you dress it up. And if you dress it up such that you play to people's comfort, then you simply get comfort and people feeling modicum of self-calming. So that's one point. The other point that I think is an interesting one here, and I don't have an answer, I just want to look at this because I think it's a provocative proposition, is, what is the function of an individual teacher? And can that function be taken over by a group or a community or a sangha? And there's a kind of canard I've heard in contemporary discussions about spiritual practice that suggests that the age of the teacher is over. And this is often in response to the perception that the teacher-student relationship, particularly a teacher with a large group, is problematic because the teacher will often cross the bounds of propriety and power relationships and things like that.
And ethics.
And ethics as conventionally understood. And so this idea that the teacher is a thing of the past or an old paradigm, and that what we need is a new paradigm, is an interesting one because it's definitely a contemporary notion. And, I have mixed feelings about that. We saw this transition with the San Francisco Zen Center when Richard Baker Roshi was the teacher, and then there were some improprieties and associated relationships. And as a result, the San Francisco Zen Center instituted a board of directors, and the board of directors would determine the appropriateness of the next teacher, the resident teacher, and they kind of turned spiritual teacher into university professor. And I'm not sure that that's necessarily the right way to go, because a relationship with a spiritual teacher is by design intended to push our boundaries beyond what is ordinarily programmed into us as a social creature in a society, and to challenge us to take responsibility for our being outside of the context of that kind of propriety. That doesn't mean it's a license for licentiousness or self-gratification, but it does mean that we have to be willing to take certain kinds of risks, especially social risks, because the spiritual path really does ask us to step outside of the comfort zone of living in a society with other mammals. So in that sense, I feel like there's a role for the spiritual teacher. From our tradition, because we're coming from a more westernized tradition, we don't absolutize that relationship. We consider the teaching function as a role, and the relationship with the teacher serves a certain need. In fourth way terms, it's as though you're allowing someone to function as your will, such that you can develop the capability of actually enacting a will on your own. And that is a kind of discipleship, because you trust that the teacher is going to direct you to do things that may not be comfortable and may not be things that you want to do in a given moment, but to develop the capacity to turn on that dime and do those things gives us the flexibility to ultimately turn to something within ourselves that's very subtle and allow that to act effectively in the face of all of the mechanical habits that we have.
I'll just add a final comment, which is that I don't know how things are supposed to work in terms of the transmission of spiritual practice from guru to disciple. I don't know how things are supposed to work with a teacher-student, because those words carry different meanings. I don't know how the future is supposed to unfold with regard to these questions. And I don't exclude the possibility that something new will come together in a way that no one could predict. I could understand how possibly a sangha could become the teacher, but it wouldn't be the kind of Sangha and it wouldn't be the kind of teacher that we know from historical examples. And yet I don't exclude it because I don't know. I honestly don't know. And I would be delighted to be surprised by developments that are yet to be experienced.
I guess I'm wondering what is trying to be protected. I mean, it seems as though there's an assumption that it can only get worse. You were now just speaking to this a bit. What if it can get better? But my main question was, what is trying to be protected?
Well, that word protected automatically puts it into the egoic human realm, doesn't it?
You mean the word I chose?
I'm saying that it's not only what's being protected, but who gets to decide if the protection is either necessary or effective after it's enacted. And that too, I don't know the answer to. In other words, I understand that mysticism is deliberately difficult to define precisely because it's magical. There's a magical element to the effect of my teacher and his transmission to me and others. But that doesn't mean I can define it in words. It does mean that I can recognize it when I see it, perhaps. Does that answer your question?
I'm going to go with yes.
I'll just add a more pithy.
That was generous.
I'll say more pithy. My sense of what people are trying to protect is their idea of what should be. And in the context of a spiritual tradition, one may be comfortable with a set of practices or a way of being and a way of doing. And when the context of that teaching changes, often with the death of a teacher, it can be very threatening to be faced with a groundless place where suddenly those assumptions may be called into question. And so when people cling more tightly or want to protect a way of being, it's a little bit like holding on to the familiar. That's how I see it. And I certainly experienced that when our own teacher died. In a lot of ways, it's a very natural tendency to want to recreate what the teacher created. And ultimately, that has to be released because we're all different. The expression of a teacher often is a reflection of the being of the teacher. And we can imprint on that and make use of that. But ultimately, for us to express the teaching, it has to be a reflection of our being. And that can be a scary proposition because that requires going deep in a way that doesn't necessarily have safety rails.
I was just reflecting on the nature of transmission when we talk about that, because, it's a word. And what are we talking about when we're using that term? Because we're talking about the egoless state. And we're talking about somebody holding that, perhaps, or a school being a crucible for that. And a being that shows up that is sufficiently empty or sufficiently full is here for a while, and then they're gone. But that state obviously is ever present. That hasn't gone anywhere. In the lifetime of that being, we're meant to hook onto that. And that opportunity and the reminding factor of that never goes. So I guess, it's up to us to have that ever in mind. The transmission. I mean, I remember one time being with Lee and he looked around the room and he said, every single person in this room is a lineage holder. I never hear anybody talk about that. So I think it's natural to worry. I think it's natural to fret. I think it's a principal human activity. And there are so many things to worry about in the human realm. And I think as spiritual practitioners that are concerned about life, the future of a school, it's even more worry on top of worry. But one of the tasks that we have is to put worry aside so that we can receive transmission. And so, is it not a better thing to be asking ourselves, how now, given everything that's going on, those of us that are here, those of us that are practicing in this kind of situation, how can we receive transmission? And who cares where it comes from? Who cares whether it comes from a book? Who cares what guru it comes from? As far as I'm concerned, you can't pollute a lineage. It's not something you should be concerned about. That's my humble opinion.
That's a nice reminder of the indefinability of transmission, I think. And because of that, the necessary magic that is pointed to by that word, transmission. So I appreciate that interjection into this discussion. When I say I don't know, I literally don't know. I used to think I knew. I used to think I could answer these questions. I used to think that that was my job, to make these discriminations, because a lot of spiritual teachers I respected and could make fabulous distinctions that were useful. So that's why I'm ever more deliberately moving to this only don't know state, because I might as well admit it. And if that's what other people want to call practitioner fixation or enlightenment fixation or whatever they want to call it, I don't care. And I agree with you that it's really the magic that I'm interested in, and how I can create a context where I'm a vessel for the magic, but not a recipient thereof. Because if I'm going to create a context for the magic, can I really transmit that? I'm not sure my teacher thought he could transmit, even though he did, in my view at least. But how did he do it? I don't know. I just felt the magic.
So I want to go back to this notion of transmission coming from various forms. And I like the way you framed it. A mature practitioner isn't going to pollute a lineage, and also is able to avail themselves of lots of different sources of transmission, because transmission, in a sense, is a reminder of something that we may already know and just need occasional reminders about that. So that can happen from community members. It can happen from a visit from another teacher. It can happen from something we read. It could happen looking at a piece of art. There's all sorts of ways. To me, the key thing that I try to cultivate for myself is a receptivity to transmission, or receptivity to being touched in that way. I was thinking of something that came up when we had Om.C. Parkin visiting with his community a couple years ago, and he was doing a darshan in our meditation room. I was trying to figure out a question I could ask, because I came up with something about certain ambiguities that arise in my mind about looking at a path towards retirement from my professional life and all the sort of physical, monetary things that entails. And his response actually was very useful for me, and it lingered with me. His comment was, "You don't have perfect trust." And perfect trust, that's the way he was articulating it, was the universe, God, if you will, has a million ways that I can end up under a bridge, homeless, and a million ways that other things can happen. And it's not really in my hands. What's in my hands is my capacity to trust the universe and trust just the presence of being, and face whatever comes up as necessary and important in this cultivation of receptivity to transmission. And when we can remind ourselves about perfect trust, I think that's a very powerful thing, because we may not have all the answers, but we can trust that the universe is presenting itself to provide to us that which we need. And I think if we hold that receptivity, we can be in conversation with the divine moment by moment. And yes, in a sense, that's a practice, because we forget, or we get tied up with the ideas and worries about ordinary life. But when we've been touched by that, we do have a basis for returning to that. And I think that cultivating that And a community that cultivates and recognizes that can be a very powerful container for us.
The other thing that I wanted to say was that our situation isn't so different if you look at the East. There are so many examples of different ways teacher and student has shown up over that. There are so many different traditions, forms, and ways. Great realizers that met their teacher once, that met their teacher for one day, and then went on to realize, found communities, people that just stayed in the village and had realization, housewives that stayed in the family, people that never left the village and had realization, people that formed vast communities. Every way that you can imagine for that particular context to arise has already happened. And every way that it could be disseminated and every way that it could fall apart, it's all already happened. And I think with our Western drama, we have a tendency to think we're unique. Look at Ananda Ma. She went through partition. All of the sites and sacred places associated with her got cut off in one side of Bengal. Half of her family got slaughtered. They just walked to another part of the country, sat down, and started meditating somewhere else. All of that just amazes me, what other people have been through and just continue to practice. And here we are facing all of this.
I'll respond to one part of your comment. Last week, Stuart and I were in Ireland. We were staying with a couple who had an Airbnb or something, and there were a lot of special things about this particular place we were in. But the thing that I'd most treasure was the unforced and natural way in which we came to appreciate each other as people who could acknowledge and mutually acknowledge our appreciation of the unseen world, which to me is a bit of a metaphor for the mystical. I've never gone to an Airbnb where I had deep respect for these apparently ordinary people living ordinary lives. He was a carpenter and a stonemason, and he'd created these incredibly beautiful buildings, and they were animal rescue people, and et cetera, et cetera. But none of that mattered. What mattered to me was the ease of communication that we had about what I was calling, and he was agreeing, was the unseen world, and the support that he got from the unseen world. It's impossible to see what the universe has up its sleeve before it reveals it. And that's nice. That's sweet.
To me, it does seem like transmission continues after the teacher's death. I mean, what are we talking about? What is that? I don't know. For me, it's just a sense that I'm being pulled inexorably towards surrender. And, I've heard it said, and I think it's true, that in one sense, the work begins when a teacher dies, that somehow you get a kick in the ass to become more responsible, not just outwardly, but innerly as well. You were talking about a balance between being willingness to stick our neck out and avoiding making egoistic mistakes.
Mm-hmm.
And it seems to me that many students function in a sangha, and that a sangha isn't just a social system, but it is one too. There is a pressure to conform and to actually follow what is calling. Sometimes you have to step outside of that. And it's not something that a lot of us have been used to doing. But it seems like the work deepens if you are in touch with what's calling and you go there and find out if you make a mistake or not.
By the way, my teacher used to use the Yiddish phrase, pacham tuchis. In other words, a swat on the butt. The universe can send you in the right direction if you're open to receiving a pacham tuchis.
Yes, I like that we're homing in on the idea of transmission and the definition of it. It feels to me like near the core of this whole theme. And for me, it's to say, have I received transmission? And the way that I would answer that is, am I stable? Do I hold a frequency, a presence? And if so, can I transmit? Can I pass it forward? Am I of use to the universe with that which I have worked for? The bottom line is the next generation. We need to help them.
Well, Gurdjieff is my go-to on this one because Gurdjieff said we don't learn except by demonstration. And so if you can, and I don't recommend this, but if you can answer honestly that you have demonstrated some useful level of three-center understanding, if you will, such that people could get it, whether they get it or not, then you're not hiding your light under a bushel.
I think another way into that is that we don't have to be perfect to transmit. And sometimes we tell ourselves a story that we have to somehow reach some sort of level or some sort of magical place before it's permissible for us to try to transmit what we know. If you're sincere and your heart is sincere, then it's important to be willing to put oneself in a position to be of service in the way you were describing. I would hear this from folks like E.J. Gold. The secret to development is by aligning yourself with a higher will. So if we put ourselves in the position of being of service to a higher will than our individual concerns, then it affords us an opportunity to deepen our practice, but it also creates the possibility of transmitting something to other people. And we should always be willing to do that.
Maybe not afraid to do that.
Yeah, but I mean, one has to trust oneself. And this gets back to this question of trust, but trust that your intentions are pure and that you truly want to be of service to something higher than yourself. And then allow yourself to be made use of by that higher will. In my experience, that's a formula for cultivating and inviting magic.
Lee used to say, stay close to the streets. And to me, it's just as relevant now as when he said it years ago, because what that says to me is that we have to have our eyes open to the field of what's around us. And we have to be able to respond. That calls for fluidity, spontaneity, discrimination. We have to stay in the present, in the field of what is around us, in ourselves, in our immediate world, in the world. And I feel like that's what I feel called to do in my practice. Because yes, there's transmission, but for me, it's transformation. That to me goes along with transmission. And transformation is something that happens over a lifetime. And the teacher plants the seeds, and sometimes those seeds scatter and spread where you may not have expected. And so to bring it down to a more personal level, my feeling about the path is that it's fluid, it's alive, it's creative, it evolves as we evolve. It's not static, it's not stagnant. And there are things that I've come to understand that I never would have been able to understand 20 years ago when Lee was alive, before he left his body. And I felt like for me, it was necessary to step outside of the form, to step outside of the group, and to really come to understand, what is this work to me? What is the path to me? And it's been a little bit scary at times because I'm not as attached or identified with what I would call the group mind or the Sangha mind, but I feel like it's been a very rich and creative time for me to just step outside and see what's there. Another thing that Lee said was, this was 3 weeks before he died, about 3 weeks. What can we create out of nothing without a filament from the past? And I think about that a lot. What does that mean to create something out of nothing? That's wild. It's wild, and it's full of the unknown, and it's full of one's own encounter with reality. Things have changed for me, but I feel like if I stay close to the heart of transformation, if that is my intention, I feel like I'll be on track.
My education in Buddhism could be summarized as the Buddha was saying that intention matters. And it sounds like that's what you've learned. Intention is almost necessarily creative, it seems to me, the manifestation of intention.
The other thing that you said that really resonated a lot with me is the path is alive. And I think sometimes when we get into practices and forms, this has been true for me, there's a tendency to think of the path as an algorithm, but the path is alive. It is life itself, and life is
Are you telling me you actually conceive of the path as an algorithm? Really?
I said that has come up.
Wow. Not for me.
Well,
We're all unique.
It just never occurred to me that that could be a possibility, to think of the past as an algorithm.
and what I mean by that is if I do this practice, I'll get this result. There's a tendency to be very transactional, and that's what I mean by algorithmic.
Okay.
If I do this thing, I'll get this thing. And that's not really my experience of the path. It's alive. It's alive. It's a mystery. It changes. It's a conversation. It's a dance. It is anything but predictable. And staying close to that uncertainty or transformation, I think, is beautifully stated.
Now I can, I hope, develop a new appreciation for algorithms, which I did not have before. So thank you, Stuart.
All right.
I wanted to just mention a couple of things that Lee was talking about a lot in the last 6 months of his life. He's really asking us and begging us. He was saying, please do not churchify this. And what he meant by that was do not turn it into a rigid set of dogma and creed. And that is the danger. You know, when we started out the conversation, we're like splitting hairs about words like the work and the path and these kinds of things. And really, it's so much bigger as we're talking about, and that's coming out, that's emerging more and more in our conversation, just how big it really is and how much it is about serving that immensity and that beauty, that divine beauty. My experience is that people are very hungry for inspiration. They're looking for reality. My experience is that we're headed into some very intense, dark times, a real descent on this planet. And certainly my teacher warned us about this and talked about it lots of times. We heard it from many, many people, visionaries, including ourselves. And I feel it and I see it. What I see is that people are in desperate need of sanctuary and that's going to grow and get bigger. And the time for us to just focus on ourselves might be over. Maybe we're right on the brink of really having to shift the focus to how can I serve the other? How can I serve humanity? How can I serve creation? Way beyond sex, S-E-C-T, traditions, all of that. It's all important. It's all sacred. The obligation that falls on us at some point after years of practice is how can we give back? What can we give back? And so as far as people not wanting to work, I have some sense in my own inner work of what it takes to really engage transformation. But I see that what the earth is going through, what humanity is going through, it's so big. It's such a total destruction of all of the concepts and constructs and institutions that have kept people afloat for even hundreds of years and maybe more. In the case of Christianity, it's 2,000 years old. Judaism's 3,000 or more. Hinduism depends on who you talk to, 6 to 8 or 10,000 years old. I do believe that there will be a living stream that goes forward, but it may not look anything at all like it looks right now or has looked in the last however many 100 or 1,000 years. And that we will have to step up, show up, put all of our differences aside and trust the wonder and the imagination and the awe and all of this that we need to carry on with, that's going to be provided because we have a true, deep, real intention to serve the divine in whatever way we're imagining or whatever way we're relating with that.
You used the word inspiration, and I've recently come to deeply resonate with the task of offering inspiration in the dark times that you refer to coming. And I'll return to what I said at the beginning of this conversation. Conversation is a way, is a means to nourish each other, nourish appreciation for the innovation that we sometimes forget that that's a legacy. That's a human legacy, is inspiration. So I hope that this conversation has been a contribution, however limited, in that direction. Certainly that's my wish.
What arose for me in the consideration about where society is going and what we're called to, or how we're called to act in that space. I don't know if we're going into chaos or if we're going into a near miss. I recall in Gurdjieff's work in All and Everything, he has a term he calls sulio annuncius, which he describes in a chapter about this phenomenon that it has to do with a particular gravitational friction between the sun and the earth and the moon and the other planets, but it creates a kind of condition on Earth. And there's one of two ways that people will respond to this tension, and that's either by creating conflict and revolution and fighting, or by deepening one's work, because the friction is the great ground for deepening work and deepening one's depth of being. On the other hand, it's an uncomfortable kind of vibration. And so for people who are not anchored in the work in some form or another, it tends to manifest as the kinds of conflicts and the kinds of tension that we see played out about us in the social and political realm. So I agree. We're called to show up to this. And in part, showing up means demonstrating how to be in the face of this by cultivating depth of presence and not being in reactivity to what's happening. And that's the invitation for us. And I think that's the call for us. Being close to the street means being willing to be present to other people, even in their suffering and uncertainty in the face of these dark times, to demonstrate and to present a kind of stability of being and a kind of awareness of a larger context. And I think that that can be a great gift that we give the people that we come in contact with. And I do believe that that is one aspect of how transmission will take place in this current phase.
I've enjoyed this conversation, and I just think this is the best thing that we can do in the face of all the considerations that have been articulated.
I underscore that I appreciate the way in which people showed up for the conversation. And more, and this is always to us the part of the secret sauce of Robert Daniel Innes's teaching, I've come to appreciate how conversation is such a lubricant for spiritual practice, spiritual depth, spiritual transmission, all of the above. And this conversation today is one example of that. And we find more and more it's important to be in conversation with anyone who's willing to partake about issues like this.
And offer good-hearted attention and appreciation.
Yeah. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you.